It's sad to know that people died for causes they believed in the past, only for people to forget the wars that they fought in. Wars of the interwar period between World War II and I are often forgotten, including the Greco-Turkish War. Yet, they shaped the world as we know it today. So what if it were the Greeks and not the Turks that won this war? First, some background. So after the carnage of World War I, Europe was in chaos. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires were dead. France had been bled white and would suffer the consequences when it was occupied by Germany in 1940. The old order had been erased with its kings and queens. The Ottoman Empire, being one of the losing Central Powers, was carved up among the victors. The empire collapsed completely like a house of cards, and the victorious Entente powers carved up Turkey like it was Thanksgiving, with the Treaty of Severus in 1920. One glance at the map will tell you how absolutely brutal this thing was, and just how unrealistic it really was. Of course, Turks would not sit idly while their nation was dismembered, and under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the nationalist Turks defeated those who were willing to defend the Treaty of Severus. During the following Turkish War of Independence, the Turks fought off Greeks, Armenians, and French forces. The later Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 left France and Italy with economic spheres of influence rather than zones of influence in Turkey, and the Turks were able to reobtain large swaths of land. The fighting with the Greeks was especially brutal. Now, the Western Allies, particularly British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, had promised Greece territorial gains at the expense of the Ottoman Empire if Greece entered the war on the Allied side. These included eastern Thrace, the islands of Imbros and Tenedos, and parts of western Anatolia around the city of Smyrna, which contained sizable ethnic Greek populations. Of course, the Triple Entente was not that trustworthy. There were more Greeks in Smyrna than in Athens itself, and Greek Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos sought to liberate these Greeks in Asia Minor. He was inspired by the quote-unquote Megali idea, literally the great idea in Greek, which wanted to recreate the Byzantine Empire. This was about as ludicrous as Mussolini's plans to recreate the Roman Empire. However, Venizelos' main argument that Greek Orthodox Christians had to be protected was barely justified. In the region of Smyrna, Greeks were not an overwhelming majority, and it is estimated that there were 375,000 Greeks versus about 325,000 Muslims. And so, 20,000 Greek troops landed in Smyrna on May 15, 1919, saying that they could, quote, occupy any strategic points in the event of any situation arising which threatens the security of the Allies, end quote. The military operations of the Greco-Turkish War can be roughly divided into three main phases. The first phase, spanning the period from May 1919 to October 1920, encompassing the Greek landings in Asia Minor and their consolidation along the Aegean coast. The second phase lasted from October 1920 to August 1921 and was characterized by Greek offensive operations. The third and final phase lasted until August 1922, when the strategic initiative was held by the Turkish army. The Greeks hoped to break up the Turkish forces initially, although the Turks methodically retreated until they were able to regroup and fight. As the Turks mounted in strength, France and Italy conducted private agreements with the Turks and sold military equipment to counter Greece, which was seen as a British client. A new Bolshevik government of Russia became friendly to the Turkish revolutionaries, as shown in the Treaty of Moscow signed in 1921. The Bolsheviks supported Mustafa Kemal and his forces with money and ammunition. Finally, the Greeks launched a major offensive in 1921 with 9 divisions. This broke the Turkish defenses and occupied rail lines in the Anatolian heartland. However, the Greeks faltered, which was their fatal move. Instead of pressing their victory and crushing the Turks in an encirclement motion, the Greeks suffered from division and from overextended supply lines. They were running out of ammunition, and after ferocious fighting close to Ankara, about 40 kilometers away, the Greeks had to retreat. Finally, within 2 weeks, the Turks drove the Greek army back to the Mediterranean Sea in an offensive that was a smashing success. Later, the Greeks and Turks agreed to a population exchange, and thus the Megali idea was lowered into a grave. So what went wrong for the Greeks? How could they have won this war? The main issue with Greece was their internal division and awareness of war. Our old buddy Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos was toppled in elections in 1919, and thus the Greeks lost a charismatic leader who had promoted expansionism during the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913. Let's say that Venizelos either wins the election or doesn't hold it at all and thus retains power. Secondly, in our timeline, King Alexander of Greece died from a monkey bite. and thus his father King Constantine I returned, who wasn't exactly cozy with the Entente. This caused great dissatisfaction not only to the newly liberated population in Asia Minor, but also to the British and even more to the French, who opposed the return of Constantine. On this alternate timeline, King Alexander doesn't get bit by a monkey, as ludicrous as it sounds. Sometimes it's the littlest things that make the biggest differences in history. In this alternate timeline, there would be no replacements in the army, which actually occurred to substitute the Balkan Wars, and World War I experienced pro-Venezuelan officers with pro-King Constantine officers. These changes dropped the morale of the troops significantly and also contributed to further disorganization of the Greek army. In our original timeline, with King Constantine back in power, France now shied away from Greece and concluded an agreement with Kemal in order to protect the Syrian mandate. Italy, which was still mad at not getting more territorial gains in Anatolia, decided to cooperate with and support the Turkish nationalists. So, in an alternate timeline, the French and Italians instead would side with the Greeks. Instead of overextending their supply lines, the Greeks would have to set up defensive lines around Smyrna and its hinterland. It could also annex most of Thrace. French and Greek forces would cross the Merik River and march to the outskirts of Constantinople. The French, seeking an opportunity, would send more troops to reinforce its claims in southern Anatolia, as dictated by the Sykes-Picot Treaty. In our timeline, a pitiful 15,000 French troops were sent before being defeated by Kemalists and withdrawing as the Greeks collapsed. In the east, the Armenians would pour into Turkey. In our timeline, the Turkish-Armenian War was disastrous for the Armenians, with over 1 million Armenians already massacred in a genocide. The Armenians were pushed back and actually lost 50% of their land. This alternate timeline, with the Turks faltering against a strong Greek bulwark and French incursions in the south, the Armenians would be able to create defensive lines, although not nearly as large as promised to them by Severus. The Italians could realize their dreams of a colony in Lycia, and thus would gain a strip of Turkey in the south along the coast. A new treaty would be negotiated, with Turkey losing substantial amounts of land. Greece would gain Smyrna and most of Thrace, France most of southern Anatolia with its rich coal fields, and Armenia a chunk of the eastern provinces. The zone of the Straits region with Constantinople would be made an international region with primarily British and some French oversight, although it is most likely handed to the Turks sometime down the road. The Kurds could actually receive their own nation, and Kurdistan would be carved out of southeast Turkey as dictated by the Treaty of Severus. We could see massive population exchanges as Turks leave Smyrna and Greeks move in place. Turkey in this alternate timeline would be vengeful, and as World War II dawns, would join the Axis powers to reclaim its lost lands. They would do so with German aid and crush the Greeks, but it would be a fleeting victory since World War II would have still lost by the Axis powers no matter how you slice and dice it. The Soviets could annex Trabzon in eastern Turkey and gain a sphere of influence over the Straits. Kurdistan could expand into Syria and Iraq with lines drawn to prevent further ethnic conflict. Turkey could come under the western sphere of influence to counter Soviet aggression. Overall, Turkey would be drastically weakened in this alternate timeline, and surprisingly, Greece may be too. The Greco-Turkish War was no cheap matter, and Greece wasn't a wealthy power to begin with. The added cost of pacifying the newly acquired land full of Turks would empty their coffers and cause economic crisis. In the long term, however, Greece would be a bigger player on the world stage and could potentially join NATO in the modern era. I can't say if the Middle East would be more peaceful or not, with lines drawn on ethnic divisions. People will find excuses to fight anyway, or resources and whatnot, so let's leave it at that. Thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe for more great content. This is Scholar of the World, signing out.